All right, ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the program this morning. We don't talk a lot about international issues very often on the show, but I feel like, it's certainly something we need to pay attention to so we're not blindsided. And I've got this article here I'm looking at. It's from The Atlantic. The headline is The Coming Middle East Conflagration. Israel is bracing itself for war with Iranian proxies as Tehran escalates its provocations. I thought it'd be a good idea to introduce you to a guy by the name of Omar Qudrat. He is the former political advisor to the NATO ambassador, former Department of Defense counterterrorism prosecutor involved with the USS Cole attacks, 9/11 attacks, Gitmo. His parents actually immigrated from Afghanistan to America in the 1970s. Omar, good morning to you, sir.
Good morning.
I know there's a lengthy introduction, but what can you tell us about this situation in the Middle East right now? What role does America have to play in there?
Well, that's a key question. And, when it comes down to the direct question of would Russia back up Iran in the event that Israel and Iran engage in a conventional confrontation, the answer is it depends on what the U.S. is going to do and how far the U.S. is willing to go. And that's historically been the primary determinant for how world powers decide how they'll engage. But right now, Iran's global policy involves not getting sucked into a conventional military confrontation, but rather expanding its power economically, politically, maintaining control over the European energy sector. And certainly Israel has real interest. You have Hezbollah and Iran that are now very close to Israel, near the Golan Heights, all over Syria. Reportedly, Iran wants to create munitions capabilities that are resident in Syria. And of course, Iran has the most aggressive intercontinental ballistic missile program, which China is reportedly helping Iran with. And so it's probably unlikely that Russia is going to want to get dragged into that kind of confrontation. But it's also unlikely that Iran is going to want to get subsumed in a full-blown war with Israel.
I mean, and so we have a deterrent here. So in terms of how they don't want a full-blown war, but this article talks about, fighting it via proxy. And so is that what you're saying, like Hezbollah comes in, places, basically these smaller terrorist groups that don't exactly represent a nation state?
Let's also remember that Iran can turn Hamas on and off like a light switch, and Iran can, through proxies, attack Israel, and they have.
Okay.
The question is Israel going to get drawn in and want to engage with Iran conventionally? And it's possible, but Israel itself is also not going to go into a full-blown conventional war the way the United States, for instance, went into Iraq. So, Russia's role right now, Iran is just a tool to Russia's global policy. And Iran is important because of not just countering the influence of the West, not just because Iran is willing to put boots on the ground in places where Russia is now considered by some Israelis in Hebrew called the landlord of the Middle East, but also with energy. They're aligned. They also are engaged in influencing the outcome in Venezuela, and both Iran and Russia trying to have a satellite state in the Western Hemisphere from which they can project power into our hemisphere. And in the case of a war in the future, that could be a very important geopolitical position that they have in the Western Hemisphere. But no, Russia is not interested in getting sucked into a war because Iran found itself in a limited confrontation with Israel.
What's the relationship between the United States and Israel like, in your opinion, right now?
I think it's always going to be strong, no matter what the debate is at home. Look, Israelis are saying, you could ask Israelis, and you could look at the reporting there across the demographics. Israelis feel that this administration has been the strongest pro-Israel administration in their memory. So the relationship, I think from the perspective of Israelis, when you try to take a look at what they're saying from their shoes, is they feel that it couldn't be stronger. And so the U.S. is going to back up our most important ally in the Middle East, Israel, and we have in the past, and we're going to continue to. Iran knows that. And so Iran is not going to, they know if they end up in a conventional warfare situation, they will lose south of Saudi Arabia. They're stoking instability to the east of Saudi Arabia and Bahrain. They have Hezbollah in Lebanon. Iran has killed countless Americans in Iraq during our war there. What they want is satellite states that they can control all over the place while remaining outside the jaws of the United States.
We're talking with Omar Qudrat, again, former political advisor to the NATO ambassador. The president, I mean, and listen, I think it's been very popular on my program when we have reported about the president's policy, trying to make good on this promise to end what has been perceived as kind of endless wars and that sort of thing. I do know we still have now troops in the Syrian oil fields, and so I wonder if you have an opinion on that. Specifically, I saw where, and again, we don't talk about international issues that often, Omar, but specifically, I did see where Bashar al-Assad said that President Trump was one of the greatest American presidents, just because he's more honest with the intentions and doesn't try to take the moral high ground in terms of saying, yeah, we want the oil. That's why we're here. Did you see that? Did you read those reports?
I did. Bashar al-Assad is a war criminal and a mass murderer and a professional propagandist. So we should not really try to be influenced or listen to what he's trying to say. But our interests in Syria fundamentally have to start with the question: what should our involvement be, and why? So, what is the vital U.S. national security interest in Syria? And I think for now that's ensuring that our gains against ISIS remain irreversible, keeping our boots on the neck of ISIS and making sure that they cannot regenerate. So I think what the American people have to think about is there is a difference, in my mind, from my perspective, between ending endless wars from bring the troops home. Those are two different things. We have troops in over 100 countries around the world. No one's talking about bringing the troops home from the European Command Area of Responsibility or Japan, where in places like that we're ready to fight. But then also no one's talking about bringing the troops home from places in Africa where we're not just ready to fight and enabling partners, but sometimes we actually end up in some confrontation. And so I think the American people need to ask themselves and try to work out in their own minds, what do you want from your president? And is it acceptable for us to have a light special operations force footprint that are not engaged in war? We won militarily against ISIS, and while our special operations forces are going to end up in some confrontations, the question is, can we understand that there's not just a black and white two-category system of war, or we have no presence whatsoever. Our special operations forces manage conditions, and I think that it should be acceptable to the American people that we have a light footprint of special operations forces around the world who are managing conditions as appropriate and not necessarily engaged in a war.
And I think and again, I'm not a foreign policy guy, but I mean, I like the idea of, hey, if you're a threat to us, we'll bomb you back to the Stone Age and fly home. I mean, that tends to be reasonable to me. I mean, as well as, like you said, limited boots on the ground where it's appropriate, right?
Yeah, and all we have to do is go back and look at what the Obama administration's posture was. And so President Obama was fully on board with an air campaign, and that alone just didn't do it. This was recent history, and we all observed that President Obama's posture towards Syria politically and militarily was a failure, and it's sort of created this chaotic situation that we're now in today. So you got to have some wherewithal on the ground in some places. It doesn't mean that we have to be in a war everywhere, but again, I think that there's a difference between ending endless wars from bring the troops home, and I think 1,000 special forces in Syria, or whatever number that the commanders and military leaders assess as appropriate in terms of a personnel commitment to manage conditions, not be in a war. I think the American people should think about accepting that. And the fact is that President Trump has American troops still in Syria, and so I think we're going to protect our interests there while at the same time not being involved in any sort of civil strife, civil war. We're going to protect our own interests.
Did you think that what happened? I mean, I remember a couple weeks ago. I know we're running out of time, but we had the situation between Turkey and Syria and all of that, and then there was the vice president went over, negotiated the ceasefire, and then you had a situation where, well, I think right before that you had ABC News airing a war footage from Syria, and it ended up being from a Kentucky gun range. And I thought, it's kind of felt like an agenda to me. But how did you think that whole Turkey and Syria situation shook out?
Well, thankfully, our Secretary of State and Vice President were able to get there and bring about a situation that we hope is going to be lasting. At the end of the day, we want less chaos in Syria instead of more chaos. ISIS and terrorist organizations thrive in contexts of chaos. So far, what we see is the United States, I think, has been taking the right steps. We don't want to be bogged down in a conflict that clearly is going to go on for a long time without, we really need to just understand what are we trying to get out of this situation for the American people. And I think that our leaders understand that that's protecting U.S. national security, the American people, and I think that this president is going to commit whatever level of resources and mode of resources that's going to achieve that.
Omar, Qudrat, we appreciate it, sir. Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure meeting you. Appreciate you spending some time with us this morning, giving us your perspective on things.
Thank you very much for having me on.
All righty, folks, we're going to take a break. Back in just a moment.